have a conversation. This is the second time that we've done this, and we'll be doing it again on March 24th to discuss Medicaid expansion. But with us today is Molly Minta, our higher education reporter at Mississippi Today, and Vaughn Gordon, the executive director of the Alluvial Collective. You'll also see Marshall Ramsey, Mississippi Today's editor-at-large, who's going to be chronicling their conversation in real time. So if any of you in the crowd want to see what he's working on as they're speaking, just flag in. I'm sure he'd love to show you. And, and so obviously the topic of today's conversation broadly is critical race theory, but I'm gonna not go into any more details and let you two just have a wonderful conversation. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much for introducing us. So as Kaylee said, I'm Molly. I cover higher education for Mississippi Today, and this is Vaughn, who works with the Alluvial Collective, which works to increase conversations about inequities in Mississippi. And as Kaylee mentioned, the reason for our conversation is we're talking about critical race theory. We're pretty timely. The legislature, the House, just passed the Senate bill. We all maybe thought they wouldn't, but they did. And before we kind of jump in, I think we're going to try and talk a little bit about critical race theory in a broader context in Mississippi. What are some of the, the things that critical race theory talks about, race and racism? Why is it important to discuss that in Mississippi? But before we kind of jump in, I just want to give a little bit of an overview. I think probably everyone here knows what critical race theory is, but just to reset before we jump into the conversation, it's essentially an academic framework that looks at the impact of the American legal system on racial minorities. Some key ideas of critical race theory. One probably really key idea that I think is important for our conversation is intersectionality, which essentially looks at, this classic metaphor. If you look at the American legal system as a cage, and there's a person is a bird inside the cage, you would look at sort of the person's different identities and how does that impact how they interact with the cage. So a black woman would have a very different experience from a white man based on both her gender and her race when she engages with the legal system. So that being said, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah. So let's jump in. My first question, I think something that I haven't really seen a lot of people get into that I think is really interesting is people don't know. So Derek Bell is one of the founders of critical race theory, and he worked as a lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and he actually litigated a school desegregation case in Leake County in Mississippi. And his experiences working on that case were really formative for the academic work he later did to develop critical race theory. And I would love it if you could talk to us a little bit about his experiences.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. I recognize we've got a lot of new friends and some old friends who are here with us, and I'm sure there's some others watching online. So I just want to thank y'all again for the opportunity. Personally, certainly on behalf of the collective. And if I may, I recognize the legislative breakfast. I want to say hello and send my condolences to a dear friend of mine, Zakiya Summers, who serves in the House, the loss of her mother. Zakiya is an incredibly hard worker, really smart person, and I just want her to know that we are grieving with her. And today's also my mother's birthday. So I'm going to take the opportunity to say happy birthday to my mom, if you don't mind.
Happy birthday.
There is, and also let me thank you for taking, you just did the hardest work of defining CRT. There's a definition that I'm really fond of. Leanne Bell describes it in a book about teaching for social justice. And she writes, critical race theory analyzes and challenges mainstream narratives in law, history, and popular culture that uphold the status quo. And a big part of how they do that is through counter storytelling. In the spaces that we try to create at the Alluvial Collective, formerly the Winter Institute, is spaces where stories get told. Here in Mississippi, I think it's really important that Dr. Bell spent a lot of time here, and it was informative in how he thought about this theory. So he is already in Mississippi doing some work in the early 1960s, 1961, 1962, and there's an opportunity to help with the desegregation of Lee County schools. And one of the interesting things there is there was a Rosenwald school already there that was of deep value to the community. It had served the community well, even in the context of gross underfunding and frankly, gross segregation. So there was a need by there's a need that the black people in particular in that community had to have an equitable education experience. The legislature could have fixed that, but it did not. I think a lot of communities are grateful for the Rosenwald Fund and the schools that they created. But this community had a school that it valued and it worked. And there were people there who were concerned that by desegregating the schools, they might lose this really valuable asset that they had poured themselves into, and they had produced a lot of opportunity for their children, and actually for a lot of them. Now, one of the things I've learned about these communities, Harmony is one of them, is that they are really strong, they're resilient communities. And we know in other parts of the country, strong communities like that got destroyed, whether you're talking about Tulsa or Rosewood or others. So the context really matters in that way. He recognizes that the law is really critical to desegregation, really to unleashing the potential of being a citizen in the United States for everybody, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Another interesting thing about the context within which this happens when Dr. Bell shows up here in Mississippi is there's a famous speech, there's lots of video of it, of Senator Stennis talking about civil rights bills making it to the Judiciary Committee in the United States Senate. And he asked the audience rhetorically, do you know how many of those bills have made it out? And he said, I think with his fist in the air, not a damn one. So that's the context. When we think about what critical race theory seeks to do, it seeks to have a full examination of the impact of race in our society. And I think it's been fun and in some ways funny to watch this conversation happen nationally, in part because in many ways it is detached both from the real impact of systemic racism, but also what it looks like in the communities where we live and work. So, the story of that work with Dr. Bell here in Mississippi was essentially that he was a skilled litigator. They won the case. And years later, he bumps into the family, several of the plaintiffs, and they're having a conversation about whether or not the strategy he proposed and followed was the best one. And he said he was not so sure. To me, that's important in the Mississippi context, but because when I talk to people like my in-laws, my grandmother, folks who were in school when the schools were desegregated here in Mississippi, you'll get a lot of different opinions about whether or not that desegregation was good. We have to remember desegregation was a means to the end of making sure schools were funded equitably. I think it is Dr. King who talks about this fear of desegregating or being integrated into a burning house, right? People had real interest. They knew, they had, self-determination, they had agency, they knew what was good for them. And in some ways, the desegregation of schools stripped communities of some of that power. And so I think that's why the story of Lee County is really important for us as Mississippians, because we're local folks, right? we tend to think local. So my great hope for all of us actually is that we will kind of do what this definition of critical race theory says: analyze and challenge the mainstream narrative, the one that we've heard most of our lives that shaped how we see ourselves in community, analyze them for their impacts. And you gotta let me share one quick story. And I know this is supposed to be an interview, not a dialogue. But I'm gonna share a really quick story of what this looked like for me. It's 2004, well, 5. So I've been married less than a year. I am taking a course at Jackson State by this amazing black woman. I think Dr. Mvusi was her name. I just got married, a lot was going on. My memory's not as good as I wish. And this was the book that she assigned: Critical Race Feminism. Now, I grew up in Sunflower County, Mississippi, here in Jackson and in Detroit. And I was raised by amazing women, but feminism was not something I understood. I didn't know how I could show up in the world in a way that, despite the privileges I had as a man, I could be the most incredible ally to my wife. So think of all the people in colleges right now who are going to be citizens, well, they are citizens. They're going to be voting one day. And hopefully they'll be married or they'll have partners. And they need to understand how to show up in a way that allows their partners to experience and achieve their dreams in the same way they want to. There's an article, there's a piece in here by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is probably most famous for her work on intersectionality, but she talks at great length about her experience being both black and woman. And it was like, damn, eye-opening for me. So that is both the large scale, the systemic level at which CRT is a really valuable thing, but that is for me a really personal example. It was one of the spaces where I was trained to think about what is good for both of us, where our interests converge, so to speak, and where I needed to be a better ally for my wife and partner. And just so you know, the Lord has a sense of humor. A year and a half later, we had our first daughter, and we've had 2 since then. So I've gotten a hell of a lot of practice going back to critical race feminism and being able to embrace it, despite, some fears that I've, culturally, the spaces I grew up in, people said things like, the man ought to always be the head of the household, right? The men in the barbershop would say, you need to make sure you earn more than your wife. That's the reality of where we live our lives. I know better because of, frankly, my interaction with critical race feminism and some other things. That was a short question and a really long answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that. You mentioned another tenet of critical race theory, this idea of interests converging. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, maybe how we can understand that idea in Mississippi, like local examples in Mississippi?
Ooh, local examples.
Sorry to throw you a curveball.
That's a tough one, but I will tell you, so Dr. Bell is one of the people who, I think, one of the scholars who's written most about this, but he talks specifically about some of the civil rights gains and how they were really made possible not because there was this great awakening in the country that, black people or Native people needed their rights or they deserved their rights. That was a part of it, but it was also that it benefited white America too. For folks who are curious about the civil rights struggle of the 60s, the story is told of the Birmingham bus boycott. But when the president got involved most actively, it was when I think the State Department and diplomats started to send back how what they were seeing on TV played across the globe, right? And as the Cold War is emerging, we cannot project out equality and the dignity and respect of every human being. And here we have German shepherds biting our community's babies. So the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, based on Dr. Bell's work, had as much to do with what benefited the whole as it did just the need to extend these rights, basically to live out our Constitution. And so I think that's an important thing for us to consider. I've always been fascinated by debates about affirmative action. You know, when I was in college and since, one of the things that I've always heard about affirmative action policies was that the biggest beneficiary of those policies were white women. And most of the data bears that out. But the burden of affirmative action and the stigma around it is typically borne by black people. So I think we have to ask ourselves that question. Are we doing things for the right reason or doing things in the interest of equity and justice? Or are we doing them also because it's in our self-interest? So there is a local example, because I want to shout out some people. Yesterday there was a conversation with Speaker Gunn and Lieutenant Governor Hoseman and Senator Simmons, Representative Johnson. That was a fascinating conversation about how the flag came to be, like how they made that happen in the legislature. And it's a fascinating conversation in the convergence of interest. You know, I love all of them. I respect all of them. But it really is, I encourage everybody to go watch it after you watch everything that Mississippi Today has posted, of course. Go and watch it, because the speaker, he talked so powerfully about that experience. And one of the thoughts I had after watching it, and it was a somber thought, was there was nothing, in my opinion, that he said about what changed that Senator Hillman Frazier and others haven't been saying since they were first elected. So what interests converged in the summer of 2020 that made it happen? I think it's a question worth us asking, because we will see these conversations again. There's a windfall of infrastructure dollars, right, coming into the state. One of the things we know about infrastructure is, historically, where what got placed had an impact on the people living there. And most of the negative impact, particularly in our urban centers, the negative elements are borne out by the black and brown people in those communities. So are we thinking intentionally at our Department of Transportation about how this ridiculous amount of infrastructure dollars are going to be spent? Are we thinking about equity, or are we only looking for where our interests converge? So anyway, that's a local example maybe.
One thing I find really interesting about the idea of interest convergence, when I was interviewing students in Mississippi's only law school class on critical race theory, they were talking to me about how, on the one hand, the idea of interest convergence can seem a little like Machiavellian almost, like it's not these like pure ideas of equality and justice that are leading to these social changes, but quite simply the like economic or material realities of how does this change benefit people who have power in society. So there's sort of that maybe more cynical interpretation, but then there's also a way of thinking about it where it can actually provide like a roadmap for how to create change in society if you can identify these like points of converging interest or even like solidarity.
Yeah, you know, my friend and colleague now, the Alluvial Collective, Chauncey Spears, often talks about how we prepare ourselves and young people to be better citizens. And one of the important things I think we have to do is let go of some fear, so that we can really do a deep and honest examination of who we are and how we show up in the world, and the systems that we are part of, the institutions we're part of, and the systems that we encourage. So, the fascinating thing to me about first of all, that was an incredible piece that you wrote. I think many people were drawn to it, not just because of there's just a beautiful story there that's encouraging to me, but I recognize that same story probably scares the heck out of some folks. I'll just sit that there. And I think people have to, those who are a little anxious by that story and perhaps think of it as a step toward losing some ground, should really examine the why behind that in their private time, right? In their prayer closet, so to speak. Think about where the fear is coming from, because we're seeing this with the whole CRT debate. It's rooted in the fears around what young people are learning and what that might tell them about who we are, or make them question about who we are. So, I've worked with amazing young people for a long time, and I've been in spaces where we've talked about the death of Emmett Till, and the white students in the room have shared all of the emotions of guilt and shame and assumed blame and a lot of other things, almost all of which are unhealthy when it comes to how we move forward. And I've had the experience of black kids, particularly black males, 14 or 15, wondering about their own value. A really good friend of mine said this about white kids learning about slavery and feeling some kind of way, that parents should applaud their white child who comes home and is upset about slavery as a white person, because it's evidence that that child has a moral compass. And so when we think about the value of a moral compass for budding citizens, that's a really important thing. And for a black child to learn that they do have value. What happened to Emmett Till is not something anyone deserves for any reason. So the complexities of how our young people are raised to explore both our history, but also kind of draw from that lessons for how they need to show up as citizens, should really be at the heart of this. Not our fears of, and some maybe they're legitimate loss, fears of status, right, and all of that stuff. The old men in the barbershop told me if my wife earned more than me, she'd start picking out my clothes. I like these socks. She's doing a great job, right? So I think it's really important that we always come back to that. Questioning our fears and focusing on the building. Building is a crazy word to talk about with children, but cultivating, nurturing children who do what they told us my freshman year at Ole Miss. They said the unexamined life is not worth living. Can't remember which one of the philosophers said that, but I'm sure there's somebody who taught University 101 who's really excited that I remembered that. But if we raise young people like that, many of the issues that critical race theory has unearthed, the systemic challenges, they will slowly but surely start to fall by the wayside, and we'll have a country that we're much more proud of.
What you're saying kind of, to me, connects to what you talked about at the very beginning of our conversation about an important aspect of critical race theory being counter storytelling. So in the case of the school desegregation case that Derek Bell worked on, we, when I was in elementary school, high school, Brown versus Board of Education is a key part of what they teach us of the history in this country, and then this narrative, I guess of implication, but just this other story of that doesn't get taught of, well, in some ways, Brown's versus Board of Education perpetuated a lot of harm or led to a new type of harm. I think this idea of counter storytelling also connects a lot to the work that the Alluvial Collective does. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about other examples of counter storytelling in Mississippi.
Oh, thank you for that invitation. So I'll tell you, I remember talking to I don't know what grade she was in, but my middle daughter, she was talking about Lewis and Clark and the expedition. And she was so proud of what she learned. Her older sister, who's a couple years older, asked her, so tell me, she was like, tell me about the other people in that story. What do you know about them? And so there were Native people there, right? They're just a backdrop. Not only is that's disrespectful, it's a really bad way for us to learn our history, right? So if we polled our middle school students and asked them if the original people in Mississippi, if any of them are still in Mississippi, they would probably say, no, they died a long, long time ago. But Chief Ben is a steward of an incredible history and community over there that most of our young people don't even know exists. So that's like a contemporary context of how not knowing who we are. One of my favorite poems is called The Low Road, and it says at the end, one of the lines at the end is that, when we say we know who we mean, and each day we mean one more, as a way of growing in community and adding strength. I think it's a shame that more Mississippians don't know who we are and what our stories are. I can tell the story of the grandson and great-grandson of sharecroppers on both sides of my family in the Mississippi Delta. And it's important that I tell my children that. But I also want them to know, Governor Winter was the governor from 1980 to 1984, and he had been in office in Mississippi since the 50s, which meant he was a segregationist politician at one time. So they know him, they love and respect him, not just because he was the education governor, but because of the personal and political evolution of his career. And they know he couldn't have been elected dog catcher in the 1940s or 50s without being a segregationist. So in our work, we want, first of all, we don't go anywhere we're not invited. And when we get there, one of the first things we do is put people in circles because circles are one of the oldest forms of community. When you think about a fire in the middle, the best way for everybody, the most number of people to get warm is to form a circle. And we recognize that at the fundamental level where people are living their lives in community, they need to have a couple of things happen. They need to be able to see each other fully. They need to be able to hear each other fully. And the one thing everybody in the circle is an expert in is their stories. It's intimidating when you show up in a space and you know there are people in there with expertise and you don't feel you have an expertise. But when you show up and all you have to do is tell your authentic stories, who you are and where you come from and what shaped you, and that's all everybody else has a license to do, then you get to know each other in a unique and different way. And the experience of our work over many years has been that we start with that process. And before you know it, people become curious about the things they learned they did not know in the stories. Wow. I grew up on one side of the tracks in Moorhead, Mississippi. I'm 42, and the only white person I know from the other side of the tracks in Mississippi is Governor Phil Bryant. And we've never had lunch together, right? So a welcome table or a dialogue circle would have been really phenomenal for my grandmother and for me. And I'm sure maybe on Facebook I'll get a white person from Moorhead to shout me out and say, hey, let's have coffee, and I'll do it. But at the local level, where communities embrace dialogue and learning about each other as opposed to operating based on our perceptions, it deepens our connections. It creates real power for us to create meaningful change together. And it becomes a kind of change that we're all mutually invested in. Now that sounds, a little naive perhaps, or Pollyannish to some people. But I will tell you, for my friends who are really adamant about the need for systems change, we have to always remember that it's people who manage systems. Like, this is a legislative breakfast. The legislature writes the laws which shape the systems. The flag changing is in a lot of ways a byproduct of relationships that were built and people being able to hear each other through story differently than they had heard before or than they understood each other. And so it creates an energy of its own. We won't take credit for that. We can't take credit for that. But every community where people show up and practice some of these principles, good things happen. And if you're a cynic, at least you know what cards people lay on the table, right? I'd rather know you, even if I'm knowing you don't like me, than to assume. I'm much better off. So another long answer to a short question.
What you said also reminds me of like what James Baldwin says about being in the North versus being in the South. How people will be more candid about their racism in the South sometimes.
Yes.
I want to ask, I feel like something I know very well as a journalist is is asking questions of people who are experts. And I'm wondering, what do you see when people are sharing their personal stories? What kind of questions do their community members tend to ask them?
Oh, wow. One of the first things I always hear is shock. Like, oh my God, I didn't know that about you. Or, oh, something else. I had the same experience. Right? I mean, let me come back to the desegregation of schools in Mississippi. I want to challenge the people in the room, because I know there are a few of them. I see enough gray hair to know that some of these folks were, of that first class. When the schools in Mississippi were desegregated, that was an incredibly traumatic experience for everybody. Now, critical race theory will challenge you to examine who got the jobs at the newly integrated schools and who had to go find another line of work. But it was a deeply traumatic experience for everyone. And not many people have had the opportunity to tell those stories or share them with folks who might have been on the other side of that trauma. Right? The assumption might be, if you're a white kid at Murrah, that it was hard on you because you went home for Christmas and you come back and bam, 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 your world is turned upside down. And you might think that the brown kids who were going to your school benefited. All you can think about is the benefit that they were supposed to get from it, not recognizing that perhaps for the first time in their lives, they're looking at a teacher wondering if that teacher has their best interest at heart, wondering if that teacher sees their humanity. Imagine the position at that point in time that a black family who was already living on the margins, imagine how the power they felt or did not feel sending their kid into a newly integrated school where they didn't feel like anybody in that administration answered to them. They weren't going to their churches. Like, that happened all over our state. And several people have said this to me over the years, particularly in Tupelo. They have this thing they call the Tupelo Way. And one of the things that's grown, one of the things they pride themselves in is the approach they took to desegregating their schools. They, some well-meaning people brought the community together and said, we are going to make sure our public schools are our institution. Clinton tells the same story. And there can be a healthy debate about how they actually did that or whether that's really, really true. But you look at how those communities sit in Mississippi now, how they are thriving, there's a direct correlation between the sense of leadership around doing as little harm as possible compared to other communities which embraced a different way of educating their young people that frankly embraced the segregation of old. So the stories will make all of the impact real. And I bet my career on it.
I think that we're getting close to sort of the end of our conversation, and you have brought some very interesting books, and I'm wondering if you could kind of talk us through them and why you think it'd be important for people who are watching to engage with some of the books.
So I'll talk just a little bit about them, because at the end of the day, I think that, where there is fear, information is often a really important part of the process of getting beyond it. So for people who care deeply about their communities, care deeply about their children and the institutions that they worked hard to build or be a part of, and they hear what people are saying about CRT, or maybe it's the Black Lives Matter movement, or whatever it is that is creating anxiety for you, I want to encourage you to go out. Like, there are people who have spent a lot more time studying this than the talking heads on TV in most cases. Some are local and some are international, right? So I talked a little bit about this book. I can't vouch for everything that's in it, right? And I don't feel the pressure to, so I don't think you should either. So check that out. That's Critical Race Feminism. There's probably an additional addition to this book. This, I think, is a second. Derek Bell, who was the father of critical race theory, actually wrote the foreword for it. So that's an interesting one. This is one of my favorite books. This is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. My daughter's had it for the last couple of weeks, so ain't no telling what'll fall out of it. But Dr. Kendi, the subtitle is The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And one of the points he makes is that the root of racism is not ignorance and hate, which many of us, particularly in the South, have been taught to believe. He says that the root of racist ideas is narrow self-interest, economic, political, and social self-interest. I like to say that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, it's a damn good day to be a racist, right? People don't subscribe to and operationalize racist ideas until it's in their best interest to do so. So this is an interesting book to check out. This one is unfair. It became a favorite book of mine a few years ago by Adam Benefardo. He just talks about some of the assumptions we make about ourselves and how they show up in our criminal justice system. And for our work, when we put, bad, like, we believe in our memory, right? But our memories are horribly flawed. Yet we lock people away for their whole lives based on memory. So anyway, or the rest of their lives based on memory. This is a local one, but a goodie. Dr. Stephanie Rolfe, who's a professor at Millsaps, wrote this book a few years ago called Resisting Equality. It is about the Citizens Council, and I lift it up because if you want to see how systems get shaped and how systems get shaped to resist equality, this is a really good book to do it. And all of the people named in this book are not dead, so there's opportunity for us to have some real conversations now that perhaps are restorative about where we are and where we can go. The last one is for our parents who are deeply concerned. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? By Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. It's an amazing book that not just talks about race and identity, but it also talks about race and identity in the spaces that we are most protective of, our schools. If we've got a millionaire in the room and they like to buy a copy for every member of the House and Senate, I'd be grateful. The last night, we could pass them out like masks. And we'd all be better for it, but I know that there are limits. And the last is Heather McGee. This book is The Sum of Us. And she tells some really powerful stories about how, out of fear and out of self-interest, or what we would call kind of tribal interest, the interest of people who we consider part of the we, how in pursuit of those interests, we destroy a lot of public goods. I'll be 42 years old in a couple of days, and I can't swim. I think, man, it's because I'm afraid, and I had a couple of traumatic experiences with water in my noses when I was young, But I also didn't get to grow up in many communities with swimming pools. And I always wondered why. And I found out that, somebody thought it was a great idea to use a lot of cement to shut down public pools. There's lots of examples of where valuable public goods were destroyed so that we would not more fully integrate as a society. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about these. I don't make any money off of any of these authors, just to be clear. I just think it's really important that we feel the voids that our fear sometimes thrives on with good information. And I, in this work, am like many other people. We're always open to a conversation because that is the fundamental building block of our building of a community. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah. I have just one last question,
Yes.
Which is, when I kind of ask broadly, is there an aspect of sort of the whole discourse and dialogue around critical race theory, or maybe put differently, a question about critical race theory that you would like to answer that I haven't asked, or something you want to point out that you feel like people miss?
Ooh. Critical race theory is just one of many different ways that we need to examine the impact of oppression in our society. It is one thing to think about where we want to go and how we get there. But it's another thing to do an examination about how we have destroyed human potential for generations. And I can't think of anybody I know who would read a book from beginning to end, from cover to cover, about critical race theory that would not come away with a sense of conviction about being better, about our need as a society to be better. We often say that previous generations did not know. One of the things that Dr. Kendi lays out really well in this book is people knew, and we got the history that we have. People knew. So we're going to have to do better ourselves. Speaker Gunn and others yesterday, he quoted members very powerfully who said to him, I've talked to my wife, I've talked to my children, and I cannot vote the way I was going to vote. I've got to change my vote. That's an example of what happens when you learn something new or you connect in a different way. Now, when people say that about their children or their spouses, and you've been living in the house with them, let's have more conversations at our dinner table about these hard subjects. And out of the mouth of babes come some interesting truth. I can't remember the last time my wife fixed a plate for me. Because my daughters say, Dad, we think you should always fix Mom's plate. When she'll eat my cooking, I do. But it's like, in really personal ways, this exploration of who we are matters. And CRT is one among many, many others that we absolutely need to employ. Don't be intimidated by the jargon. Don't be intimidated by what the talking head on TV said about it. Get in there for yourself. So that's my story I'm sticking to.
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think we are wrapping it up. Our last step is Marshall is going to show off the cartoon that he has created.
To quote the great Ted Lasso, always be curious, not judgmental, which I think he was quoting Whitman. But anyway, this conversation today has helped me want to become more curious and to have more conversations. So Vaughn, thank you so much. And I decided to have you solving the puzzle from Wheel of Fortune, what is CRT? And of course, Vaughn gives a very short answer there that said, I'd like to solve. It's a full examination of race in our society. It's analyzing mainstream narratives. It's being a better ally. It's the opposite of fear. It's empathy. It's learning about each other, which I think is technically the right answer. So I think you get the prize and you get a trip to Moorhead. Congratulations.
Wow. Ooh, you got the proportions of my head right. Boy, that's...
Oh, well, I have a history of doing this sort of thing.
That's
So.
a big old head, man.
You're welcome.
Marshall. Thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you guys for coming, and I think this was a really great conversation. I took away a lot of new stuff. I'm sure Vaughn and Molly will stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you all.